Crazy Welder, and welcome to another episode of Gaming Gripes. I know I haven't done these for a while, but here we go. I might as well start with this game since I've been playing a crap ton of this one lately. And right off the bat, what you'll see right here is, as you can see, Lara is actually just standing basically on thin air. And mind you, this is a game from the recent decade. It's in the latter half of the 21st century, and yet we're still having these problems. And, it's funny because as soon as she steps off, all of a sudden she's standing on solid ground, and the inverse kinematics are doing exactly what they're supposed to. And, she's able to move her feet, and she's able to align her feet to the terrain around her, but it only seems to happen in very specific areas where she just wants to do it, or where developers decided that it'd be okay for Lara to do it. And so it just really doesn't make sense. It's like, how come you can do it there, and yet your foot still clips through, and yet other places you can't? It's like it doesn't make any freaking sense. And here's the other part. So I'm playing this game on PC, and as it turns out, unless you happen to be running an NVIDIA card, and specifically something like a 1080, unless you have all of your settings turned all the way the hell up, and unless you're running on something like a Titan XP, you can't honestly expect this game to run at any sort of a decent frame rate. And for me, being on a liquid-cooled AMD Vega FE card, I get random crashes all the time. Now, I don't know if it's the game itself or if it's my card, because I seem to have these in certain other games as well, so it could be my hardware. But mind you, again, who programs this so that it runs so poorly? Now, I'm also running in DirectX 12, which is not, how this game was originally designed to be run. Obviously, it originally came out with DirectX 11, and the DirectX 12 patch was added later on. But for DirectX 12, I'm honestly not seeing that many features being utilized. Now, the performance is a lot better on the AMD cards when you do enable DirectX 12. Of course, the modern architecture was primarily designed to take more advantage of DirectX 12 features, but in all honesty, I was kind of expecting a lot more. It just seems like there's so much missing here that they could have utilized, and it seems that the skin shaders could have been a lot better. Even on the PlayStation 3, for example, if you look at characters like Nathan Drake, they get a lot more wet when it's raining. You don't see this really happening on Lara. I mean, there's some specular highlights here and there that they've sort of just kind of dazzled in there, but it doesn't really look that great. And here's my other gripe with this game. When you come up upon NPCs, they only have brief conversations to offer you, and they pretty much always stand around doing the exact same thing over and over again with really not that much change in dialogue. And, just talking to them, they only say a couple of little things. And when they do say it, it's not particularly interesting either. I mean, look at this guy talking. He's just talking a bunch of BS, basically. It's not even anything that pertains to the game or anything that you're doing. They just talk complete nonsense. Now, granted, these guys are basically like part of a cult that's defending the city, and, you could get into that if you're really looking at the story, but it just really doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And then there are certain other things that, I just have gripes with, as far as, for example, climbing animations. They just don't seem to flow that well. For a character that's supposed to be, extremely agile and extremely well-talented, somebody like Lara, her animations just don't really blend very well, and it kind of takes away from everything in the game that you're doing. Like, for example, the way that this is done for the rolling animation, sometimes it works out well, but in other times it just looks completely awkward, and it's like you're kind of breaking one animation and starting another. And it, what happened there? How come she couldn't land that properly? It really irks me, because in a game from the modern age where you have so many different options and so many different third-party software that you could potentially utilize to make this happen, people just don't, and especially, not developers of a game of this caliber, which, is obviously a AAA release, and you can see my frame rate just totally dove right there for no reason, even though there's absolutely nothing happening on screen, and it's not as if the vegetation got any denser. It just seems completely poorly optimized. Now, granted, this could just be the PC port and it could be my hardware. I'm not exactly running a beastly rig here. But the fact of the matter remains, if you have a game computer that, is like super, super high-end, and you're running this game, the only way you're getting good FPS is pretty much if you're on Intel and NVIDIA hardware. Otherwise, you're pretty much relegated to a stuttering mess, especially under DirectX 11. If you have a newer AMD card, you can get a little bit of a better frame rate, but for the most part, it just kind of doesn't really cut it. And, this is just some of the gripes of the game engine itself. Maybe they'll improve it for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, maybe they won't. It's kind of hard to say at this point. And something else to note is that, overall, the effects of the water on the environment are also incredibly minimal here. If you just kind of take a look at what's going on as far as the water and what's happening when it's raining, they create a couple of these sort of like little mini puddles that are supposed to give you the idea that there's water there, but really it's just a crappy shimmering shader that takes away from the experience more than it adds to it. And to me, this is kind of ridiculous, considering, again, if you look at some of the PlayStation games, and even some of the 360 games from back in the day, they had much better water effects, you know, streaming down surfaces and so on, that made it look a lot more convincing than what they've done here. And I feel like the devs just kind of took a really lazy approach graphically to make this sort of thing happen. But let's move on to some of the other gripes I have with this game. What I want to focus now is actually on the physics. The physics in this game sometimes seem to just be really wonky and glitch out for no reason whatsoever, and it seems completely sporadic when it does it. So like sometimes if I'm trying to grab onto something, Lara just either doesn't do it, or if I'm trying to jump and launch, she'll either let go, or what ends up happening is she just ends up coming at it in a really awkward angle. And for a game that's got such great physics overall, when stuff like that happens, it really just kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now the best part is actually to watch Lara completely fail, and I'm going to see if I can make her do it right here. But the funniest part is just the way that the physics takes over is also extremely awkward compared to a whole lot of other games nowadays. It just make it seem much more seamless for the character in general. Now what we'll see here is I'm going to try and take a huge dive off this rock, and you'll see essentially Lara screws up, and then she has a hard time kind of adjusting to what just happened. So I'm going to do this, but I'm going to screw up totally, and she's going to fall. But as you can kind of see, she basically sort of glided on these different levels of surfaces, so it wasn't exactly smooth. It's not like I slid down the mountain. It was more like there was these invisible borders where Lara essentially just kind of falls down really slowly into these different grades. And to me that kind of breaks the immersion, because in a game that's otherwise so flawless in its execution, having Lara essentially have these sort of invisible balls that she hits really doesn't make any sense, because it takes away from the overall immersion of the game. And then there's things like this where, you know, I'm completely walking through this terrain and now I'm somehow up above it, but it's like, you know, where's that even coming from, and how come I can't proceed that way if you let me go this far? And again, it's just another issue of these invisible walls that ultimately permeate the entire story of the game. And these happen to be everywhere, and you know, it's not just like in one area. And again, you can kind of see right there, I landed on what, according to the game, was a rock, even though clearly I landed in water when I was actually over there. So it's just different things like this that ultimately get kind of annoying, because when it happens over and over again, it just gets really buggy, and sometimes when that happens, your character actually gets stuck in places that she shouldn't get stuck in. And to me, considering how many of these caves had to have gone through a pretty rigorous QA process from this, you know, game developer, I would imagine that they probably shouldn't have let stuff like that go. And here's a, you know, shimmering rock for one reason or another that happens to shimmer when it wants and then all of a sudden stop later on. Another one of those different graphical oddities. Now, this is an area where I actually dug up some gold or coins or whatever it is called in this game. And, you know, it kind of props up all the time, and I don't know if, again, it's just my hardware or if that's how the game is in DirectX 12, because it doesn't seem to happen in DirectX 11. But, you know, again, just this little graphical artifact that seems to go on from time to time. Something else that I've noticed, too, is a lot of times when you shoot into these, like, different rope sections, for example, with these giant wooden pillars, sometimes Lara can pull them like they're absolutely nothing, even though it looks like, you know, it looks like a log that potentially 4 or 5 people would need to pull, and yet some days she's able to just yank it right towards her with, you know, making a couple of grunting noises, and other times, like you see here, it took her absolutely forever and it moved precisely nowhere, even though if you look at the wood, unless somehow the game designers, you know, decided that it's different types of wood, like one of them was made of balsa wood and the other one's like oak, somehow she's able to pull one faster than the other, which just makes absolutely no sense. It's like, why would you design it this way and then release that to the public? I mean, it's one of those things where, you know, there's so many nitpicky little details about this game that just come up from time to time, and it's like, I get it, it's an open world game, you know, there's certain sacrifices to be made, but it's just that it's not even that big of an open world game. You know, we're not talking like Assassin's Creed scale here. We're not talking even GTA 4 scale. You know, not even anything like GTA San Andreas. Maybe, I mean, maybe comparable to GTA San Andreas in some regards, but, you know, at the end of the day, it's like, it's not that big of a world. There's all these different regions that you can fast travel to, but they're not, like, massive. So you would think that, you know, after them having played this game for ages, and obviously they intended other folks to spend a lot of time in this game with all the extra material that they put in, but it just kind of nags on you after a while, because ultimately it's such a small world to play in that this shouldn't be a problem, and yet it persists every single time that you try and, you know, play. And again, there's all these little kind of bugs that happen, and it's like the way that Lara moves around these obstacles can be quite unnatural from time to time. But let me show you some other physics glitches that I've kind of encountered in the past, so you can get an idea for what it is that I'm talking about. Alright guys, so we got a pretty good example here. I'm up in one of the places of the Soviet installation that's basically a giant kind of camp or a mine or whatever you want to call it, and there's this giant shaft over here, which, you know, I guess they used to use for just sending these carts along with the soldiers on them to their deaths, because I can clearly see no tracks, so I don't know why they would have that there. I guess it's some kind of coal storage, or maybe they just dumped the carts of coal down that way into oblivion. But here we go. I'm just going to dump Lara down this giant, you know, kind of stairway looking thing here. And it's like, see, what just happened there? Why did she slow down when clearly not only is that full of ice and it's a slippery surface, I mean, unless her foot got caught on one of these little, you know, whatever, wooden divots, how is it that she just stood up and started walking? Like, is she just defying physics and gravity in general? It makes absolutely no sense to me. It's like, why would that ever be the case? This would happen to precisely nobody if they were actually trying to do a slide like that, and yet it happens to Lara because, I don't know, she's magic and she just happens to avoid, you know, situations that involve actual physics in this world. It's completely bizarre. It's like as if she's Spider-Man, but she's not at the same time, but it's like the developers want you to kind of feel like you're Spider-Man when you're playing Lara, and it doesn't add up. It's like every single time that you take the slide, you get a different outcome. Now, granted, you know, that's cool because it kind of makes it feel like there's something, you know, actually different happening, but the problem is that when you get the sort of, you know, experience of instability within the game's physics, you never know if you can rely on you being able to actually jump off and save yourself, or if Lara is just going to decide that she's not going to jump all of a sudden, and then you just end up basically falling to your death at that point. And, you know, to me, that makes the game a lot more difficult, because if you're trying to do something that's predictable, and it's predictable every single time, that's great, you know, that makes your life that much easier. But if you're trying to do it, and you don't really know what the engine's going to decide is going to do that particular day, it's kind of like, you know, if somebody were to give you a loaded revolver and say, hey, you know, just keep pressing the trigger and play Russian roulette and hopefully you don't get killed, you know, it's one of those things. It's like, if the game wanted you to do that, then why didn't they make that a feature as opposed to something that clearly is just bugged physics within the game engine? It's one of those various situations in this game where it behaves in ways that you really don't expect it to. And again, you know, on the one hand, you might think, oh, well, that's kind of cool, actually. You know, I like it when things don't go according to plan sometimes. Because that's, you know, it's Tomb Raider after all. Things aren't always supposed to go to plan. But, you know, they use this whole cliche of, like, falling rocks and debris whenever you're climbing stuff. And it's used over and over again, and I get it. It's Tomb Raider, and, you know, they do it in the series from Nathan Drake as well. You know, Uncharted is known for doing that stuff to you all the frickin' time. It's supposed to be there to add tension and all this, but it's like, it's always predictable. You can pretty much see it coming from a mile away every single time. And this is one of those situations where you just never know, and it makes the game that much more difficult to play. Because Lara is sometimes able to catch onto things, and sometimes she just isn't. And it's never entirely clear where she can do it and where she can't. Considering this is another one of those games where, you know, basically every single thing that you see on the map is marked with some kind of objective, the fact that, you know, certain, I would say, hook points, or whatever you want to call them, for your grappling hook aren't necessarily marked. And it's like, if I were Lara, and I were using this grappling hook all the time, I would be able to know what locations I can grapple to just through common sense. And I guess maybe they expect you as a gamer to know that, you know, those are grappling locations there, and that is common sense based off the training tutorials that you're just supposed to know. But the problem is you never really know. And sometimes areas that you would think would be grappleable just aren't. You just, you know, you will try and shoot your grapple out, and it's like, oh, I can do it here, or wait, I can't do it here in this area. And it's one of those things that just kind of grinds on you after a while, because if you're expecting a certain outcome when you launch the grappling hook and all of a sudden it doesn't save you mid-jump, it just brings that additional layer of frustration that you really don't need in this game. And it's like, you know, even with these rocks, so like sometimes I can jump off and I can launch my grappling hook, and then Lara actually does it and she manages to grapple onto something. Other times, it's like, I'm just not even going to do it, and I'm not going to bother to do it because I don't care enough. And, you know, I just don't get it. It's like, if you wanted to design this game in a way that was much, you know, as much fun to play as you possibly could, you wouldn't have included that as a freaking feature that works this way. And so, you know, maybe I'm just used to this sort of world nowadays where all the games basically give you all the hints all the time, because there's too many bloody controls to remember and there's just too much going on, and so you're never going to be able to know all the freaking button mappings and all this kind of stuff. You know, I get it, and maybe just I had my expectations set the wrong way, that that's how things are supposed to work with this game. But at the same time, it's like, for all these different, you know, kind of options you have, such as your special vision that shows you exactly where you can climb, it's like, why couldn't you just do that for the grapple points, but make it something that's a little bit more obvious? And so it's just, it never really makes sense. And the other thing is, like, sometimes I can take a jump like this and just totally, you know, ride it out and land it, and it's cool. And then other times I'll go off of one of those cliffs and I just, you know, I just eat shit. And it's like, well, how does that make any freaking sense? That you can do it in one location but not the other? And, you know, the worst part is that some of those jumps are completely innocuous. It's like one of those things where if I were to jump from that height, I would totally land it and be fine. And yet, because they have these, like, kill boxes in the game, you basically end up falling into them and then you're toast, you know? And it's like, there's no way of knowing if it's going to be a good area or a bad area. It's just never really explicitly stated to you. And so the problem is with this game having so many different levels of verticality, and I mean, you can see that there are very high levels of verticality because you've got caves that go on down under, there's caves down there that you don't see right now, there's that whole ridge over there that you can climb and it goes even higher, and then there's that whole ridge up there, which is, you know, a ridiculous climb. And it's like, if you have that many levels of verticality, you should allow Lara to go to as many places as she possibly can. And you can see another kind of physics bug right there too. I just basically got gored by that deer, and Lara's just like, oh, whatever, I'm just going to shrug this off and walk it out because, you know, no big deal. It's just a giant, you know, piece of bone that got stuck into me, and yet I'm completely fine. And yet, when she gets knocked over by the enemies with melee, which, you know, obviously don't have nearly as much mass behind them, absolutely nothing happens to her. And it's like, again, where's the consistency in this game for this kind of stuff? So the physics, you know, they're just so weirdly buggy that sometimes you really have no idea what's going to happen next. And again, you know, I don't know if that's by design or if the game was just meant to be this buggy. It's never 100% clear. So here's my other gripe with this game. So you get to really buff out Lara with all these different skills and all these different options throughout the game, which make her like this total badass. She gets to climb ice faster, she gets to do all these other extra really cool things, and yet for whatever reason, she doesn't seem to get any stronger climbing stuff throughout this game. And what I'm trying to say is, she always shimmies at the same speed, always climbs at the same speed, despite the fact that you're able to upgrade how quickly she can climb ice. Which makes me wonder, why couldn't you make it such a system where the more Lara climbs, the faster she's able to climb, and the faster she's able to progress and shimmy along all these different ledges within the game? Because ultimately that's what's going to happen if you keep climbing, you're just going to keep getting better at it. And it's one of those projection systems that, you know, I feel like it could have actually been made totally progressive, you know, like it could have been made sort of invisible to the player. Like, maybe don't make it a skill, maybe just make it something that happens to Lara over time, and maybe you just give a player like a notification that says, hey, by the way, after having climbed blah 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 number of steps, you're now able to climb faster, or, you know, shimmy faster or whatever, because you've been shimmying for so long, and you've got the muscle memory to do it, and you've got this and you've got that, allowing you to effectively be a more efficient climber. But yet it never happens, and instead what we end up getting essentially is these cheap sort of mini upgrades to Lara that kind of make her better, but at the same time really kind of don't, because certain skills just remain the same. Like, yes, she gets a second, you know, little hammer. Yes, she gets the grappling hook. Yes, she gets the knife, which she couldn't use before. But it's like, all of a sudden, she just knows how to use these tools, and to me, it's like, well, wait, you know, didn't she have them in the previous game? And it's like, didn't she already know how to use them from before? But I guess, you know, it's like, okay, for progression's sake within this game, and for not making things too easy on you, they had to do it this way. But it's like, why don't you just make a base for the character that you had in the previous title, and then build on that and make them a lot stronger? It really irks me, because it's like, why can't you guys just make the character start at a certain kind of, you know, let's just call it a power level, right? Where you just know that she's going to be A, powerful, and she's going to get B, powerful, or C, powerful at the end of the game because of the different things that she does. I actually really love tossing these freaking chickens, because it's just fun. I don't know how else to describe it. It's a really good pastime of mine, because sometimes things just really piss me off in this game, and then I end up just tossing chickens into a fire, because, you know, that's ultimately where they belong. And you get XP for it, so you might as well do it. Now, one of those things that, you know, I feel like could have been done a lot better, aside from this sort of progression system that I mentioned here earlier, is, you know, the fact that when you have Lara in these different situations, you would expect that she would learn also different skills in terms of fighting. But yet, despite everything that she does, despite all the enemies that she faces, she never really picks up any grand new skills. There's never, like, this system of, you know, learning additional moves, or learning a way to take down an enemy that happens within the game, that I feel is a totally missed opportunity, because she gets to do, you know, these heavy takedowns, for example, right? Which you don't learn until you essentially pick up that skill. But it's like, how would you learn that normally? You know, it's like, why do you just get granted this skill based off, you know, some random bullshit experience that you got from doing other stuff, as opposed to, you know, actually learning it the proper way, which would be actually attempting to take down a heavy, and then finding, you know, after taking down like 6 or 7 different heavies, that, hey, there's a weakness in the armor over here, and I can exploit it, and learning that way. You know, to me, that seems like a more natural progression system than what they've actually implemented here, which is a system that, you know, I feel too generic for a game of this scope and of this, you know, basically caliber, really, at this point. But, you know, among those things, here's something else that really gets me. For some reason, the camera in this game makes Lara aim at the center of the screen, and it's like, you know, if she was actually aiming this way, I would be shooting where that barrel and that fire is. Now, granted, okay, you know, right now I'm aligned to it and it kind of makes sense, but if you kind of sort of look at where her gun is actually going, it really doesn't make sense, because it's like she's aiming way far to the right and way too high up. It doesn't make sense. And even if you're aiming kind of low, she's still kind of looking too high for where the gun should be, you know, pointed at that. And to me, that kind of just grabs my attention, because if you look at games like Gears of War, or you look at games like, for example, Resident Evil, your character never aims at this awkward angle. They're always aiming kind of like straight ahead, which, you know, makes a lot more sense, because if they were actually looking in that direction, they would be aiming that way. And I guess their whole thing was that they were trying to align her gun with where your reticle is supposed to be, but it just looks so awkward. And the other thing that I really take offense with is actually the fire effects and smoke effects that they've done in this game. They just feel like they're completely 2D. All they're doing is they're having a bunch of sprites that spin as you spin, and they make it seem volumetric because of the way that, you know, they animated it, but at the end of the day, it's all completely fake, and it looks like garbage. I don't know why anybody would have, you know, smoke that looks like this in the modern day. It just looks really bad. And it's like, maybe they could have designed something with more particles, but it's like, look, you've got all these fancy particles flying around throughout the air. You've got all these leaves that are circling me. You've got, these extra layers of smoke up in the clouds, that turn darker as they go up. But yet, you couldn't take the extra time to actually, design this in such a way that it would be more volumetric. And so that, you couldn't make the smoke move as Lara moves through it. It's like, why do you have such primitive technology in a game that's using DirectX 12, in a game that was designed so recently? This just shouldn't be a thing. Especially considering nowadays how many titles have been sort of backported to include all these extra features. I mean, I remember back in the day when Stalker, I think it was like, I want to say it was Clear Sky that came out that had the volumetric smoke. I mean, maybe the first game did too, I can't remember now. But as I recall, it was using DirectX 10. Now, not that it has anything to do with the graphics of that game, because obviously, just because you have a certain DirectX version doesn't mean you get visuals like this, for example. But it was one of those things where, even back then, years before this game came out, almost like half a decade before this game came out, they had this technology, and the fact that it's not implemented here is just like taking a step back. And ultimately, right now I have my vegetation set to low, mainly because of the fact that it really, makes my whole frame rate dive completely. But you'll notice that sometimes when Lara walks through stuff, it bends. But then, like this tree right here, it's like, why couldn't you apply a little bit of extra animation and either force me to walk around it, or actually make Lara move the tree when she moves through it, or have her hand touch it and move it out of the way? It's like these little things that in a modern game just should not happen. Even if I recall correctly, games like Halo 3 back in 2007, like, again, almost a decade before this game was made, had the technology of moving all these branches around, and it's like they can't bother to include it in this game. It's like, how ridiculous is this? And even for things like this tree, for example, for Christ's sake, again, going back to 2007 with the original Crysis, if you shot a tree like this, it would break and it would splinter and it would, so essentially fall apart. But you can't do that in this title for one reason or another. Like, I'm really trying to see how I could break this thing apart, and I can't do it. And, again, it's one of those little tidbits that they could have added to this game that just isn't there. And it makes the whole kind of experience fall apart when you have destruction for things like boxes and different wood crates, and when you have destruction for things like pottery. How much harder was it for you to actually make the branches fall apart? And for example, this prop right here is essentially a static prop. I would assume that it's a static mesh, because if you try and shoot these little supports, again, absolutely nothing happens. In fact, I don't even make a bullet impact on them. If I shoot the cloth, absolutely nothing happens on it. It makes no difference what I do to this. Even if I decide that I can make a fire arrow and I shoot a fire arrow at it, it doesn't light the tarp on fire. And it's just one of those things where games that have been made a long time ago had these features and had the ability to do this sort of stuff, and yet this one just fails to do it. And to me, that's another major gripe with this game, is that for as much destruction as it has, for as much, interactivity that you have with all the different, pieces of the set that you can, like, literally move around and destroy, why is it that, parts of the environment cannot be taken down? Because it's not like any of these tents are something that's going to break your mission when you ultimately, decide to proceed with the game. It's like, okay, you broke this post, now you can't get to this chest. Big whoop. It's not like there's going to be something in that chest that prevents you from progressing further in the game. And another big issue I have is that these characters on the ground, they're kind of just lying here, and I can't shoot them. And it's like, how is it that I can shoot everything around these characters and all of a sudden I can't shoot this guy, or I can't shoot this guy? And it's like, I get it. They were the villagers that you're supposed to help. They're not the enemy. I understand. I totally get it. But it's like, why is it that they are, again, just a static mesh and I can't interact with them? I can't move their bodies around. I can't do anything with them. And for example, like, take a look at this chicken, right? So let's grab this chicken and let's throw it over here. So now the chicken falls. If I shoot the chicken, and then I continue shooting it, it moves. It's, you know, it's one of those things where it's affected by the physics of the game. You know, it's affected by the bullet physics. If I shoot it with a bow, it moves just as if the arrow had pierced it, and you can even see that it does that. If I try doing the same thing to this character, once again, it refuses to let me do it. And it just breaks the level of immersion that this game is trying to go for. Because obviously, you know, there's not an artistic style to this game that's trying to be, you know, some kind of colored palette or something, you know, very picturesque. It's definitely trying to go for realism. So how is it that things like that are omitted when a game of this caliber is going for essentially the ultimate, you know, visuals? And it was touted as a game that was having the ultimate visuals. And yet again, you know, you have certain parts of the environment that can be destroyed, while certain others seem to just completely, you know, stay away. And one of those things that kind of irks me as well is that you have fire in this game, and yet they don't have a dynamic fire system. It would have made a lot more sense if when you started a fire, especially considering that was a gasoline or a jerry can that I lit, that it would essentially spread to other parts of the environment, and yet it doesn't do it in this game. And again, it's like, how much more difficult would it have been for you guys to introduce that as a feature? Because at the end of the day, you look at this game, it's got all these extra whistles and bells, but yet the fire system is like prehistoric. We're looking at, you know, essentially a bunch of sprites that have been edited to make it look like it's, you know, it's a legitimate fire, but ultimately all it is a bunch of stitched 2D animations that are playing, you know, on a loop. It doesn't do anything else. Like, all it does is keep replaying that same animation over and over and over again for no good reason. And it's just one of those things, guys, where honestly, I feel like they could have done so many more things with this game in terms of the blending of animations, the smoothing of the physics, all these little extra tidbits just to make the title perform a little bit better and much more up to scratch to modern standards, that it makes me wonder how they get away with stuff like this. And you know, it's a beautiful game, don't get me wrong. It's a ton of fun to play. You should absolutely pick it up. Don't let me discourage you from, you know, from buying this game, because it is just an awesome game. But certain things like that just get in the way. Now, I didn't get the chance to show you some of the more serious physical bugs that I've encountered, such as actually getting stuck between rocks. I don't unfortunately have footage of some of those, but it's another one of those issues with this game that just shouldn't be present. And last but not least, I'll show you guys something else, which is that there's no sun shafts coming through these trees, even though in other parts of the game they totally do. And again, it just goes back to this level of inconsistency in this game that ultimately goes beyond something that you should expect in a title of a game that I believe was released in 2015. It's just the utmost details that should have been paid attention to are completely lacking in this title. So I'll leave you to it. You know, whatever comments you guys want to make about it, whatever, you know, your thoughts on this game are, this is where I'll leave you. These are ultimately my opinions. You know, feel free to disagree with them, but it is what it is. I'll see you in my next video.